I used to worship startup culture the way desperate people worship myths, because when you are broke, uncertain, and trying to build something from nothing, the stories of hustle disruption and overnight success feel like oxygen. They tell you that pain is noble, that exhaustion is a badge, that if you just push harder than everyone else, the universe will eventually reward you. What nobody tells you early enough is that startup culture has a shadow. And that shadow doesn't just hurt companies, it breaks people quietly while everyone is applauding the grind. The dark side of startup culture doesn't announce itself with evil intent. It creeps in disguised as ambition. It starts with small compromises that feel reasonable in the moment. Sleeping less just for this sprint, ignoring a gut feeling until after the launch, tolerating toxic behavior because they're brilliant, or we can't afford to lose them right now. Each decision feels temporary. Together, they become a system that normalizes harm and calls it dedication. I've lived inside that system. I've told people to hold on for one more month when I knew we didn't have the runway. I've celebrated all-nighters while quietly watching my team's health decline. I've convinced myself that pressure was leadership and that empathy was a luxury we'd earn later. Startup culture trains you to delay humanity in exchange for momentum, and momentum is intoxicating enough that you don't notice what it's costing until something snaps. One of the most dangerous lies is that suffering is proportional to success, that if it hurts, it must be working. This belief creates an environment where burnout isn't a warning sign, it's a KPI. Founders brag about anxiety like it's proof of commitment. Teams compete over who is more exhausted. Vacations are treated like betrayal. In reality, chronic stress doesn't sharpen judgment, it corrodes it. The decisions you make when you are depleted feel decisive, but are often reckless. Startup culture rarely connects these dots because the collapse usually happens later when the applause has moved on. Another dark pattern is how startup culture confuses speed with truth. Moving fast is valuable, but moving fast without reflection turns learning into repetition. I've seen teams pivot 3 times in 6 months and call it agility, when in reality, they were just running from the discomfort of facing why the previous decision failed. The culture rewards action over understanding decks, over dialogue, confidence, over clarity. Eventually, the company becomes a machine that ships constantly, but learns nothing deeply. Then there is the cult of the founder. Startup culture loves singular heroes because heroes make stories simple. Visionary founders are forgiven behavior that would get anyone else fired. Mood swings are called passion. Control issues are called standards. Silence is interpreted as genius. This dynamic poisons organizations from the top down. When no one can challenge the founder, honestly, bad ideas survive longer than good ones. I've been that founder, and I've worked for that founder, and in both roles, the damage looks the same. People stop telling the truth to protect themselves. Equity. Another sacred word in startup mythology often becomes a tool of manipulation instead of alignment. We're all owners here. Sounds empowering until it's used to justify unpaid overtime emotional blackmail and deferred accountability. Promises are made in percentages and vesting schedules, while cash flow realities are hidden. Hope becomes compensation. And when things go wrong, hope doesn't pay rent. The silence around this imbalance is part of the dark side, because everyone pretends the game is fair, while the rules are constantly changing. Startup culture also fetishizes disruption without asking who absorbs the disruption. Every move, fast decision lands somewhere on customers, on employees, on communities, on families. Laying people off over Zoom becomes acceptable because it's framed as necessity. Burning out a team is justified because the market won't wait. Ethics are postponed until scale, as if values magically appear when revenue does. I've learned the hard way that whatever you postpone under pressure doesn't disappear, it compounds. The language itself is revealing, crushing it, killing it. War room, all hands on deck. These metaphors shape behavior. They frame work as combat and rest as weakness. Over time, people stop seeing each other as humans and start seeing each other as resources. Once that happens, trust erodes, and without trust, no amount of talent can save a company. High performance becomes fragile performance. Perhaps the most insidious aspect is how startup culture isolates founders. You're told to be strong, to project certainty, to never let the team see doubt. Vulnerability is celebrated in talks, but punished in practice. Founders stop talking honestly to anyone, including themselves. Decisions get heavier. Loneliness grows. And because everyone assumes you're living the dream, asking for help feels like failure. This is where depression, addiction, and breakdowns quietly take root long before any public collapse. The dark side doesn't mean startups are bad. It means the mythology is incomplete. Building something new requires sacrifice, but sacrifice without boundaries turns into self-destruction. The difference between healthy intensity and toxic grind is not hours worked. It's whether the system allows truth, rest, and recalibration. I've watched companies with less funding and slower growth outlast rockets simply because they treated people like humans instead of fuel. The hardest lesson I learned is that culture is not what you say. When things are going well, it's what you tolerate when things are going badly. Every time you excuse bad behavior for performance, you teach the organization what really matters. Every time you ignore a warning sign because it's inconvenient, you train the system to repeat it louder later. Startup culture doesn't collapse companies overnight. It weakens them slowly until a crisis arrives, and there's no resilience left to absorb the shock. What saved me eventually was not another framework or productivity hack. It was honesty. Honest conversations about limits, honest assessments of risk, honest acknowledgement that no vision is worth destroying the people building it. That shift didn't make things easier. It made them real. Some people left. Growth slowed, but the decisions improved. Trust returned. And for the first time, the company felt like something that could exist without consuming everyone inside it. If there is one thing I wish someone had told me earlier, it's this: urgency is a tool, not an identity. When urgency becomes your culture, you lose the ability to choose. You react instead of lead. You confuse motion with progress. The dark side of startup culture thrives, where reflection is treated as weakness and speed is treated as morality. Escaping it requires the courage to slow down when everyone else is telling you to sprint. And this is where the story truly deepens, because once you see the dark side, clearly you're forced to confront an even harder question about what kind of builder you want to be, what kind of company you are actually constructing beneath the slogans, and whether you're willing to unlearn the myths that once kept you moving as the sentence continues into the next part, where survival turns into responsibility, and the real lessons finally crystallize, where the illusion finally breaks. Because once you truly see the dark side of startup culture, you can't unsee it. And from that moment on, you lose the most comfortable excuse of all. This is just how it's done. This is the phase where survival turns into responsibility, and it's the phase most founders never talk about, because it doesn't make good conference content. It forces you to accept that building a company is not just an economic act, it's a moral one, whether you like that framing or not. The real lesson doesn't arrive when the company fails. It arrives when the company survives, and you realize how much damage was normalized along the way. When you look at people who gave years of their lives and ask yourself honestly whether the trade was fair. When you realize that some of the behaviors you once excused as necessary would horrify you if they were happening to someone you loved. That reckoning is brutal because it removes the myth that pressure made you better. In reality, it often just made you narrower. What comes next is not a rejection of ambition, but a redefinition of it. Healthy founders don't abandon urgency, they learn to aim it. They stop treating everything as existential. They distinguish between reversible decisions and irreversible harm. They build systems that allow dissent without punishment, rest without guilt, and truth without theater. This doesn't make companies soft. It makes them less stupid under stress. The best decisions I've ever made came after I stopped confusing calm with complacency. One of the most powerful shifts is how you treat people when they are no longer useful. Toxic startup culture frames departures as betrayal or weakness. Mature builders understand that leaving is part of the system working. Not everyone is meant to run the marathon. Some are sprinters. Some are builders for the early chaos. Honoring exits instead of shaming them changes the entire emotional climate. People work harder when they know they won't be punished for being honest about their limits. The same applies to founders themselves. The bravest thing I've seen founders do is step back, slow down, or ask for help before the collapse forces the issue. This is not quitting. It's leadership without ego. Startup culture celebrates resilience, but ignores sustainability. Real resilience is not how long you can endure pain. It's how well you design your life and company, so pain doesn't become the default operating mode. Another hard-earned lesson is that values mean nothing until they cost you something. It's easy to talk about transparency until the truth scares investors. Easy to talk about work-life balance until a deadline slips. Easy to talk about respect until your top performer behaves badly. Every time you choose performance over principle, you are teaching the organization what you actually believe. Culture is not declared. It is enforced through sacrifice. The founders who escape the dark side don't do it by becoming nicer people. They do it by becoming clearer. Clear about what matters. Clear about what trade-offs they will not make. Clear about the difference between short-term survival and long-term damage. They replace hustle mythology with operational honesty. They stop romanticizing chaos and start designing stability. Not because stability is boring, but because chaos is expensive and unreliable. What surprised me most is that companies built this way don't move slower in the long run. They move with fewer self-inflicted wounds. They spend less time recovering from burnout, rehiring after cultural implosions, or explaining away reputational damage. They don't need heroic effort as often because they don't rely on crisis as a motivator. The work becomes harder to dramatize, but easier to sustain. The dark side of startup culture teaches one final, uncomfortable truth. If your company requires people to break themselves to succeed, it is not a high-performance system. It is a fragile one, temporarily propped up by adrenaline. Adrenaline always runs out. Systems built on trust, clarity, and human limits last longer, even if they never make the loudest headlines. So the real lesson is not don't work hard or don't take risks. It's this: decide consciously what kind of builder you want to be before pressure decides for you. Because under stress, you don't rise to your values, you default to your systems. And if your system is built on fear, silence, and exhaustion, that is exactly what will show up when things matter most. If this reflection on the dark side of startup culture hit close to home, stay with this channel. Subscribe, because this is where we talk about building companies that don't just survive the market, but survive themselves. And leave a comment sharing which myth you've had to unlearn on your own. Because the moment you start questioning the stories that once drove you is often the moment you begin building something that can actually last.